Morning, everyone. Thanks, Ted, for having me here. Thanks especially for having me speak at 3:30 in the morning my time. So if I'm a little punchy, that's what's going on. Since I'm the basketball guy at a soccer/football conference, apologies, I'm an American, I'll call it soccer. I didn't really want to talk too much specifically about basketball because I figured I might lose people. So I wanted to speak more generally in terms of how analytics can become vocabulary and how the power of language allows for greater adoption, uptake, and simply better discussions both in broader public and within a sports organization. Ted covered this already. He neglected to mention my 3 cats at home also, who would be very upset to know that they were left out. Again, why did Ted have me here? Ted knows that having a basketball person on stage with him makes him look smarter. This joke had fewer layers about a week ago, and so apologies, but I wrote it beforehand, so bye, Daryl. The motivating factor for my talk is this quote from Bill James. Is people familiar with analytics, sports analytics in general, specifically baseball, would know that Bill James is sort of the father of the movement. And he wrote, baseball statistics, unlike the statistics in any other area, have acquired the power of language. Now, a couple things about this. One, he wrote this in 1985. So this was very early days of kind of the analytics movement in sports. So a lot of the more advanced metrics we see now in really any sport didn't exist yet. So this is really very basic stuff. But in baseball, specifically in the American context, these numbers have meaning. A 300 hitter is not something you need to explain to an American. It's like, you don't need to say, is that good? Oh, he hits 300, that's good. That's an idiom that translates to other aspects of American life. Now, most other sports will never have the primacy that baseball had in America up until 20 or 30 years ago, so that level of cultural penetration is probably not possible. But within the sport, statistics can become these centers of meaning. And why does it matter? A few bullet points, I guess, is you can use language to ensure accuracy, to be not necessarily precise, but accurately describing the things you're talking about. A lot of times, I think you see this a lot certainly in soccer. There'll be very different interpretations of what a certain thing has happened based on how people describe it. The run of play is one of those sort of ephemeral concepts that you kind of know what it is, but you're never exactly sure what you're talking about. Interpretability is similar. If you have a shared meaning of something, then that allows people to communicate and interpret what each other are saying on the same level, rather than what ends up arguing more about terms than about facts or impacts. And again, fidelity is just making sure that everyone is sort of on the same page. Sort of a linguistics for dummies quickly, which I kind of did some research on myself preparing for this. According to people who study this in depth, language basically has 6 properties. Arbitrariness, which words do not have intrinsic meaning. They are constructs that a group of sounds, a group of letters, has meaning applied to it by us. So it's not something that's discovered, it's something that's created. Cultural transmission means that it's not something that you would know inherently what it is. You have to be taught, you have to learn what these groups of sounds, these concepts mean. Discreteness means, it's a thing is A but not B. And if it is A, it is not B, and vice versa. So it allows you to segregate things appropriately. Displacement is probably the hardest concept. It basically, the example that's used in the literature, I guess, is a dog barking only has meaning in relative to the context in what it's barking at, whereas a word carries meaning with it through different contexts. And I can't quite wrap my head around that, but I sort of understand what it means. Duality means these concepts have the same meaning in spoken word, in writing, and specifically in the case of statistics, I think this is applicable, sports statistics particularly, visualization. The same concept carries the same meaning across multiple different media. And finally, it's productivity, which means that these a word can be combined with other words to form a sentence, which is a thing of greater meaning, and sentences become paragraphs and so on. And I think that that's particularly applicable to statistics in certainly in a growing field like soccer, football analytics, is start with the smallest units, build them on top of each other, and then you can create broader, deeper meanings. I'm not going to really talk about displacement very much, because again, that's pretty ephemeral. I will touch on the other 5 briefly in this talk. Again, getting back to the point of arbitrariness, all statistics are arbitrary. There's no game of soccer, game of basketball that was discovered. It was all invented. Now this is sort of epistemological and probably not worth thinking about too much, because you kind of get lost on a rabbit hole of things being created. But really, once you get into a sport, there is one thing that is really defined. That's the score of the game, who won the game. Those things are inherent in the rules. So almost all statistics are arbitrary, but everything else besides the scoreboard is sort of a thing that happens in the game that we've applied a name to. As I say, these are representative abstractions. In basketball, for example, a rebound has been defined a specific way. The ball hits the rim, someone grabs it, that's a rebound. Now, that didn't have to be defined that way, but by sort of convention, everyone sort of knows it as such, and I'll come back to that point in a second. And our goal in creating these names, these statistics, is a sensible taxonomy that describes the game in a way that would be recognizable to someone very familiar with the game. This is a motivating factor of this talk is also these 2 tweets together. One is descriptive statistics are incredibly underrated. A big part of what Ted has done here with StatsBomb is start to create these, he's not the first, but hopefully he's leading the field in creating these building blocks of the game so that a coach, an analyst, a media personality can point to these stats and say, this is what happened in the game. And that's incredibly powerful. That everyone wants to run to the solve for everything model right away, but the first step is accurately describing what happened in a way that can be compared across games. And that plays into the second tweet here, which is the more complex something becomes, the harder it is to get people who don't know exactly what you've done to follow along. So creating these descriptive stats are the first step in kind of addressing that. I want a quick example of how arbitrariness matters in basketball. I'm going to assume a certain baseline familiarity, but if not, there'll be time for questions afterwards. I kind of created a alternative box score where I took basketball play-by-play and threw out kind of what the traditional box score people are used to seeing, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, and used play-by-play data to create kind of an alternate way of counting that if someone had done at the start, we might think of basketball differently. So, for example, in the existing box score, you can see on the left, I said, what if instead, way back in the beginning, when newspapers were first printing box scores, they had, looked at things completely differently. Now, these describe the exact same events. They just do them. They categorize them in different ways, and there's no particular reason one or the other would have been chosen at the start. We just happened to end up with the one on the left. Or what if we'd have ended up with the one on the right? And what ends up happening is if you compare those simple regression model on those stats to kind of a plus-minus model, very different players are seen as better players just based on the different counting scheme you use. The chart shows the players in blue are kind of small forwards who are liked better under kind of the traditional counting models. Centers are liked better under the alternative counting model. And that's no change in underlying performance. That's just the way that we have chosen to count seems to have emphasized certain things as good. And it's incredibly hard for people to get outside of, well, that's what's counted, so that counts. And and that's why in a sport, again, like soccer, where you're just kind of coming up with these terms, being really thoughtful about what you're counting matters, because it is incredibly difficult for people to not see what, there's the Einstein quote, the apocryphal possibly Einstein quote, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that is counted counts. But once you start counting something, it becomes it's implied and assumed to have a meaning by everyone who hears it, and that's not always the case. So you have to be very careful about how you're counting, how you're describing things. The second point is cultural transmission, and naming things matters. This is a point Ted and I have actually disagreed on in the past. I think that naming stats well is a huge part in making sure that the audience, specifically kind of sports experts, traditionalists, coaches, managers, stuff like that, can kind of come with you with a stat. The more barriers you throw up to their understanding, the harder the uptake is. On the left, again, these are some stats that I think are named well. Obviously, the basic counting stats. There's no real argument about what in basketball, you've scored X number of points, goals scored, pretty easy. Who's played in the game, straightforward. If a calculation is in the name, in baseball, whip, walks and hits per innings pitched, it's fairly straightforward. Expected goals, I think, is, while the expected, how do you get there, might be a kind of a bone of contention. What it's attempting to do is right there in the name. And again, similar with an overall player model, like a wins above replacement. Okay, if you define those three things, it's clear what it is. On the other side, in hockey, there's these kind of basic stats that are known as Corsi, Fenwick, and PDO. What do those mean? The first two are named after people. The last one is an acronym that doesn't actually stand for anything. Corsi and Fenwick basically refer to the share of shots that team gets versus compared to the opponent. It's a good proxy for possession, which is a good proxy for who's playing better. Now that concept is easy enough, but you slap names that don't mean anything on them, and people say, "What is that? Sounds made up. I don't believe it." PDO you might be familiar with also in soccer a little bit. It's shooting percentage combined with save percentage. If it's over 100%, you've probably been lucky. If it's under 100%, you've probably been unlucky. Again, fairly simple concept. The name gets in the way. One from basketball, it's accepted enough now that it's okay, but really if you think about it, offensive rating sounds much more complicated than just saying points per 100 possessions scored. That it implies an evaluation that isn't really going on. And so can sometimes, again, make people think that it's more complicated, that the analyst is trying to sneak something in there when it's really just a straightforward counting stat almost. This is, again, in a sport like soccer where metrics are emerging. If you have names that are similar, people can get confused what they are, and again, that confusion makes uptake harder. And the last one, a particular bugaboo of mine is, there's this sort of the snake oil sales of people selling kind of roll-up stats that promise accurate grades and predictiveness, and we've solved all your problems for us. Just give us a lot of money, and we'll and you don't have to do any more analysis. And these tend to have kind of names like I've put here, and those are kind of the bane of the professional analyst existence is people selling these kind of things. So again, the names are very important. It doesn't. Naming things well doesn't ensure uptake, but naming things poorly ensures that there will not be uptake. Moving to discreteness in terms of making sure words mean one thing and not another. First example I want to use is in the NBA. I think it's pretty well established that having a superstar means you are much more likely to win a championship. Now, the problem is that there isn't really a well-defined definition of what a superstar is. And I can speak from experience working with a team that being realistic about where you are depends very much on identifying that correctly. So this is an analysis first done by Kevin Pelton of ESPN that I've repeated myself along a number of other, using a number of different metrics. Basically, this graph is showing the chances of winning a championship based on the single season productivity of an individual player. It's basically as a player's impact increases, it non-linearly increases your chances of winning a championship. A true franchise player, that works out to be about a top 5 player in every season, is more than twice as likely to bring a championship with him than a core player, which roughly breaks down to a top 15 player. And so confusing between the two of where you are as a team, you can fool yourself into thinking you have a much better chance of winning a title than you actually do if you say, well, we've got the 12th best player in the league, we've got our franchise superstar. And empirically, based on 20 plus years of data, that's not really true. You're swimming upstream if you think that one is the other. So making sure that when we say superstar, we mean this one very impactful player instead of this very good but not quite all the way there player. Another example, and I think Ted touched on this in his opening remarks, is, and I appreciate that, is if something is wrong to a coach or a general manager, something is obviously wrong in terms of it doesn't mean what it colloquially means, you're done as an analyst. So in the NBA, looking at exploring defendedness of three-pointers. The NBA website has definitions of how well defended a three-pointer is. I think that they're wrong. You can see the definition here listed on the page. Basically, with tracking data, it's defined how closely defended a three-pointer is by how close the center mass of the defending player is. 2 feet of space, very close. This is body to body, not hand position, which makes a big difference. The left side, you can see the accuracy by kind of distance band, and the right, you can see distribution. Now, if we're looking at this, you can say, wow, that means that under the traditional NBA definition, 90% of three-pointers are open. I'll get to some video in a second to show that that's not right, but also that is, if you were talking to a coach about evaluating your defensive play, okay, we don't want to allow any three-pointers. If 90% of three-pointers are open, then adding in the open or guarded metric just is adding unnecessary confusion. You're probably better off just saying we allowed a lot of three-pointers rather than we allowed a lot of three-pointers. I have 2 examples of one that was called open, one that was called guarded by this metric. Let's see if you can tell the difference for this. These are both taken in the same game by De'Aaron Fox of the Sacramento Kings. That's one attempt. This is another attempt. Again, I've cut off the end of the shot because I feel like whether the shot goes in or not is very much affects whether someone calls it open or not. Now, again, the one on the left was called contested. The one on the right was called open by this data. If you showed that to a coach, yes, he has a little bit more space on the one on the right, which is also the one of the 2 he happened to make. That I don't think you will get a lot of agreement that is an open shot. It's a decent shot for an NBA player, but it's not really open. So on this chart, I've kind of compared what research has shown to be a kind of a better taxonomy, which is moving actually around 6 feet of space is a better cutoff line for what's open or not. Going back, the one on the right, the closest defender on the shot is body to body about 5 feet away. So you think if that player is a foot and a half further away, it would be described, in my mind, it would be described as an open shot, and that seems about right. And that, I think, more accurately describes the game on the floor in a way that a coach or kind of a non-analytical but experienced observer would understand. Let me see, talked about duality a little bit, especially in terms of written and spoken word. Also, Data viz, I'm not going to talk a lot about data viz. I think Ted has covered that a lot in the past with radar wars. I don't want to relitigate that. I think radars are good. Not everyone agrees, but we'll move on from that. I will say that one thing I will say in viz is that, oh God, this shows up well. What you are solving for matters a great deal. These are two shot charts from DAngelo Russell last year. The one on the left is comparing his accuracy in locations, red being good, blue being bad, versus NBA average from those locations. The one on the right is comparing his accuracy, his efficiency versus all shots in the NBA. Now you can see kind of the shots in the mid-range on the left seem like much better shots because he's better mid-range shooter than most players in the NBA, but mid-range shots are still bad. So you're communicating a completely different topic or a completely different message depending on what you're solving for in your visualization. So that's for different purposes. Where if you are preparing for him and wondering where he likes to go, where he's a threat, the one on the left might be more appropriate. If you're talking about where he's really dangerous, what shots you really don't want to give up, the one on the right is probably more important. Like, yes, he's a good mid-range shooter, but those are still good shots for us to give up. Or alternatively, if you're the coach of the Warriors now, you might, well, okay, you can make that shot, but we can still find a better one, according to the visualization on the right. The last point I want to talk about is returning again to the original, those pair of tweets I talked about originally, is productivity. Using these things to build on each other to create bigger meanings. Again, this is important for people who have, talking to people who are not super familiar with analytics as a whole, is you start small, you start with the descriptive stats, you define them well, you make sure that they are discrete in that that the audience can differentiate between A and B. And then from there, you can build up to more complex topics, because as these building blocks become more understood, the complexity of the underlying model will not change, but the apparent complexity to the person you are communicating with will. It's okay, I get that, what's next? And then you can build bigger. And so this is a, not really a production, this is an example. Say if you were to value an offensive player in the NBA, a simple model might say that his value is a summation of these kind of 6 aspects of the game. We've solved these 2 pretty well already, so we're decently far along on that. Having defined those, what happens if we define another topic well? We've increased our understanding of the theory of offensive value, and that's how using these smaller topics as building blocks can get you further away. Now, speaking from experience working with a team, again, this is a 3-year project at minimum, and in reality, you don't really have that much time for anything. But if you say, okay, I'm going to build these 2 blocks first, that'll take me a couple months each. We're further along. Independently, those things have value, as we talked about earlier. We were closer to understanding the overall value, and now I'm going to work on this. Now now you have a kind of a roadmap for incremental increase in knowledge that gets you closer to the understanding of the overall whole. And last point on that is a quote from The Wire. If anyone's seen the show, it's basically saying all of these things matter. The names matter. Picking the stats correctly matter. Making sure they're independently defined matter. Presenting them well in terms of visualizations matters greatly.